The Salty Sales Sages.
Hello everyone and welcome to episode 7 of the Salty Sales Podcast. I'm Greg Grimer.
And I'm Simon Stillwell.
And today we're going to be talking about acquisitions, mergers and acquisitions, but particularly acquisitions, and how they affect sales. We'll try and keep it focused on the impact to the sales and marketing organisation rather than the organisation as a whole, but obviously we'll have to touch on other stuff too. So, first question, we'll dive straight in. Simon, in your experience, what are some of the biggest challenges that sales organisations face after an acquisition? And I suppose you can talk about the acquiring firm and the acquired firm in your answer.
Yeah, I think there are commonalities, right? You've got two sales teams, one from the acquirer, one from the acquiree, and they're used to doing things a certain way. So the biggest problem that occurs, I think, after an acquisition on both sides is alignment, right? Across messaging, team structure, incentives, those kinds of things, right? So you've got two separate organizations, two separate sales teams, and now they've got to come together and you've got to figure out how they're going to work as a cohesive unit and what do you need to do to make that work, right? And what I've seen sometimes is the sales teams who need to have a coherent story now, right? Because they're part of a new organization, a merged organization. So the story as to why they merge and what the benefit is going to be for their customers and their prospects, that has to be really, really nailed down so that the sales team actually understand that and can explain it. Because if they don't, then they still end up reverting back to what they're used to talking about. And that becomes very confusing for their clients and prospects. And you start having real problems because you've got a misalignment really in message and value proposition, if that makes sense.
So when I go back 30 years ago, I can remember two types of acquisitions particularly stand out in my field and what was your field too. One of them was where a firm acquired another firm because it was competing with them and doing well. And the bigger firm that wasn't doing so well in sales acquired the snazzy, jazzy, sexy, possibly more expensive product that was getting tier 1 customers when they were only able to get lower tier 1 and tier 2. So classic one of that would be SunGard buying Infinity, right? Then you've got a weird dynamic where the acquiring firm almost plays second fiddle to the firm that's being acquired because they're being acquired for big strategic reasons. I suppose HP Autonomy was potentially that as well. HP acquired Autonomy thinking Autonomy are doing really well and we want some of this, success, right? The other type of acquisition, which I always found quite strange, is where they acquired a firm and they were hands off for quite a few years. And they would just let it run, and then slowly over time, it sort of, by percolation, they sort of absorbed them. But it was done very slowly. And sometimes the absorption thing was 3, 4, even 5 years. So in terms of types of acquisitions, what are the most common and what are the least common in your experience?
So the two types of scenario you've talked about, I've gone through both of those, right? Where you arrive day one post acquisition, right? Now everything's got to merge, right? So and you've got a new story you've got to tell. Everyone's got to get up to speed, and there are significant challenges with that, which we'll talk about around things like compensation, territories, key accounts, clients, all that kind of stuff, right? Prospects, as it pertains to sales people, where you end up with an organization that remains relatively independent now, so the acquiring company has bought them for perhaps their technology and their list of clients, or to just take them out of the market, right? They're happy to let them run. Those can be successful, but if they are competing directly with the acquirer, now you have set yourself up for a little bit of a problem, right? Because now when you have a new prospect, what should that new prospect be looking at? The acquirer's product or the acquiree's product? And a classic company that has this problem is SS&C, right?
Yeah.
SS&C is probably anyone that knows anything about SS&C, very successful business, but they tend to acquire these businesses and they just sort of have them under the umbrella. And I can
Yeah.
remember many years ago someone telling me that they were looking for an accounting solution,
Yeah.
and SS&C approached them with three different accounting solutions.
Yeah.
And they were all different, right? But they were different elements, different companies within SS&C. And okay, they all have slightly different functionality, but the buyer ended up saying, guys, can you please figure out at your end which one I should be looking at? And the problem there was they were all independent, and each of those sales organizations were incentivized to sell only their own product. So they all saw this prospect as a legitimate prospect. And in effect, without realizing it, they were all fighting against each other.
So how do you approach aligning different sales teams? It's pretty normal in an acquisition to see some of the salespeople get pushed out, right? There's normally a cost-cutting element when an acquisition takes place. Part of the reason
Yeah.
you're doing it is for economies of scale. How do you go about aligning those different sales teams, bearing in mind that they have been selling different products and they're going to have a natural bias to want to sell the product they're familiar with?
Yeah, that's exactly what happens. The natural bias. So, in my experience, what I've always done is I've always just sort of hit the pause. But if we haven't been able in the due diligence beforehand, and of course, that if you're the acquirer, then you're doing the due diligence. If we haven't been
Hopefully.
able to do satisfactory, really deep due diligence of the sales organization, which, by the way, is very rare, then you've got to sort of hit the pause button once you've made the acquisition. And the first thing I always look to do is to figure out, okay, what have I got in terms of the team? Where have I got overlap? Have I got clients that overlap? Have I got prospective clients that overlap? What about the products and so on? So get clarity, and I think the really critical thing day one is to be transparent, or as transparent as you can possibly be, with the sales organizations, right? Because one of the dangers is that your best performers in one or other of the businesses feel nervous and jump, right? It's
Yeah.
never the poor, salespeople, the ones that aren't performing very well that leave. They all just keep their head down and hope they can survive it, right? And don't get pushed. It's always the ones that are good that decide, to hell with this, I'm out of here, right? So
Yeah.
being transparent really early on, explaining what's happening is really important. Then I look at how the teams are structured, right? Are they structured by products? Are they structured by territory or by customer segment and so on? And then there's a very significant amount of work usually done to map out the teams, the way they're aligned, the way they're structured, and the skill sets with each of them. And then you have to figure out, okay, now once you've done all of that work and been as transparent as possible, okay, how are we going to realign this stuff to make sure it's fair? And that's before we get to something else that we will probably want to talk about, which is compensation, right? Because it's highly likely that you are going to need to reorganize that organization to reduce overlap and clarify ownership of customers segments.
What does it look like if it goes wrong?
I think if it goes really badly wrong, you end up with customer churn because they're confused. You lose pipeline prospects, you
Yeah.
lose good salespeople. There are a lot of very significant risks that can occur very quickly after an acquisition if you don't think it through. And bear in mind, when you make an acquisition or you're being acquired, it takes a while for you to understand the skill sets of the people around you, right? You've grown up in an organization, how everyone operates, the way that you're supposed to do things and what works and what doesn't work. You get thrown together and you don't really understand any of that. So if you react quickly, I'm thinking of a particular organization now that acquired another one, and their best salesperson that I knew got terminated. And I was surprised a little bit that happened. It wasn't voluntary. They terminated that
Right.
individual,
So,
and they pretty much terminated everybody.
right.
So their goal was to sort of get a clean slate. But the problem is you have to be very careful because you lose a lot of knowledge, right?
Yeah, of
And those
course.
individuals may not be the best salespeople you could ever want, or the best account manager, or even the best customer support or marketing person. But if they really understand the product and the customers are used to them, and the prospects are used to them, you are risking quite a lot by just letting people go or losing them. So it's got to be done with, in my opinion, with forethought, because the risks are very significant. And if you just lose a bunch of salespeople, you've lost that ability to close business. The reason you were acquiring the company to grow revenue, one assumes, you've just now made your life a whole lot harder because you're now going to have to, rehire or
What
hire new people and start from scratch.
What about deal size and length of the sales cycle? So if a regulatory reporting firm that has a $10,000, $25,000 typical price tag and and their sales guys are making 3 sales a month, takes over a firm that does collateral management systems for $2 million a pop, and a typical sales guy gets one deal in every 2.5 years, yeah. Um,
Yeah.
does
Yeah.
is that a hard? Presumably, that is a hard acquisition because you've got very different sales cycle culture. You've got sales guys who are transactional. You've got sales guys that are very long term strategic. I mean, is that a problem or?
I don't. In some ways, I think actually that's less of a problem because they're so
Right.
different.
Yeah.
So you would not put those two teams together and try and get
No.
everyone selling. And you see you're dissecting your revenue engine by product type. So you've now got, okay, so these guys are selling these kinds of products, which are the long sales cycle, big things, and these guys are selling the smaller ones. Now, if you can sell the big products to the clients that have, the cheaper product and vice versa, well, now you've got to set up a mechanism so that both sets of sales teams are actually incentivized to
Benefit.
make those
Yeah.
introductions,
And
right?
that's quite
and
hard.
and and that is something. It's not easy, but and a lot of organizations balk at it because, hang on a minute, now I'm paying more money. But you really got to incentivize that stuff to happen, because if you don't, you're kind of cutting your nose off to spite your face, right? No one will
Yeah.
do the work. And so you have to kind of double up a little bit of your commission, because you want, if there is the ability to cross sell these products, which there usually is, right, then you need people to be properly incented to do that work. I think it's harder when you end up with products that can be directly sold to your existing client base, right? It's another
Yeah.
product, because there you've got people that are experts in the product that's been acquired, and they're targeting the same customer base that your acquirer, their products are, but they've got a product gap. So it
Yeah.
seems like that would be really simple, but now you've got the challenge of, okay, there are two teams. There's no reason really why those two teams should be separate. They should come together, and now you've got to decide, okay, do I end up with everybody selling the full suite, or do I somehow break it down? And that can be slightly trickier, right? Usually you would end up with one sales organization, and now you've got an additional product or two to sell. It's entirely possible, but you've got to align everybody, and there you get one sales organization. That's, you've got to align targets, you've got to align compensation, territories, all that kind of stuff. And salespeople get bent out of shape, because if you're used to having a certain territory or a certain number of accounts that you're looking after, and then your sales team doubles in size, and everyone is targeting the same organizations, now you are going to have an amended territory and amended clients, right? Because we've now added two teams that actually are focused on the same thing. So that takes a little bit of time, and this is why it really does need to be thought through carefully. Otherwise it can go wrong. So I think those are harder, honestly.
One thing I've never seen, and maybe you have seen this, but I've never seen it, is after an acquisition, I've never seen that the acquired or the acquiring firm go to the market and say, and do any kind of market research to say, do you understand what this new combined firm does and offers you? There's never any kind of concerted study to do our customers understand why we merged and what we can offer as a merged firm.
You've hit a really, really important question, right? That misalignment on messaging can cause real issues, because at
Yeah.
the end of the day, so what? that you've added this product. Why would your clients really care? If it's of value to them, okay, but then you do need to explain it. And that comes all the way back to something that you said early on, Greg, which is good salespeople have, focus on the fastest and easiest route to making a sale with the
Yeah.
least amount of obstacles. So if they know how to do one thing really, really well, why would they add something else in, right? If they've now got to learn a whole new way of doing stuff, they don't like it. It can be a real issue. So, but in the end, that messaging is really important. So you've got the external message of why you've made the acquisition, why you brought these two firms together. So that should explain to the market what the benefits are. But then you've got what I think is often missed or not done very well, which is the internal messaging, right? People assume that everyone internally just kind of knows why the acquisition has been made, because your internal people are then going to go out and start talking to their customers and the prospects and so on.
And
And if there's a misalignment there, then it causes a major problem.
cultures are very, very difficult to change and morph. When you're acquiring, how much effort should you put into to studying that sales culture to say, are we already partially aligned, so that the alignment of the sales culture can be an achievable goal, because it's really difficult to change sales cultures from one thing to something completely different. You can
Yeah.
move them, the needle a bit, but it's very hard to change them.
Oh yeah. It's very hard. And I think the best acquisitions are the ones where the two companies are culturally aligned
Yeah.
anyway. But I'll give you an example. When we sold Micropal way back in '97, we sold our company to Standard and Poor's. We were a small, relatively business. I headed up the sales organization. We were hungry, and we were, driven by commission and so on and so forth, right? And we became part of Standard and Poor's. Nobody in S&P in the division we were in got paid commission. Nobody. Their salespeople were on bonuses at the end of the year, and those bonuses were dependent not on how well they had done, but dependent on how well S&P had done. And so this was a massive culture clash, right? Because I was a firm believer, and still am, in commission structures to drive behavior, right? But then I had this completely different organization in the salespeople at S&P. And I did eventually get the S&P organization focused on commissions, but it was a long, drawn out, and sometimes pretty bruising affair. And there had to be a transition period. And immediately at that point, you've got two sets of salespeople who are looking over the fence at the other set of salespeople and saying, well, hang on a minute, they've got it better than me. These guys have got great commission structures. Well, these guys have got big fat salaries and bonuses, and they're not worried about whether they hit their number or not.
Yeah.
It's that is a classic example of where it's really, really hard. And the culture was completely different.
How
So
was it
you
sold?
have to recognize those early on and deal with them.
How was that sold, or did it just happen over a very long period of time?
It took a while, and it was solved. And if you like, my way won in the end. And we lost a few S&P people, if I'm honest,
Yeah.
right? We did. But I was okay with that because they'd acquired our business and they had expectations of increased revenue growth. Well, the only way I knew we could generate that increased revenue growth is if we had highly motivated salespeople to sell the products. So we changed the culture. So the S&P business that we became part of, that business changed the culture, which is quite interesting. The acquirers' culture was changed rather than the acquirees. But it wasn't easy. It was not easy, and there was it was tough. Let's just put it that way.
So, my final question: tech stack. If we go back to our early careers, companies that were doing stuff in DOS,
We never had
Ginny
that
and
problem.
Wingo, and then they didn't want to buy anyone that did it in Unix, and so there was that thing of you made your choice on technology, and you wouldn't necessarily acquire someone with a different one. Although SunGuard used to do it, and sometimes it was a success, sometimes it was a disaster. That's less relevant nowadays, obviously, but there are other aspects to technology that
It's
are much
far
more
worse.
relevant.
It's
Yeah,
far
worse.
worse
Yeah.
now, I
So
think.
explain some of the pitfalls and how that stack and tooling and how software is developed would play a role in success or failure in post acquisition.
Yeah, it's a real problem now because there are so many tools. I mean, I read somewhere the other day, which staggered me, that a lot of sales teams in mid-sized companies have 30 to 40 different tools that they're using, right? Just a sales organization, which is staggering. The most obvious thing is a CRM system, right? So you've now brought together two CRM systems, even if it's the
Yeah.
same, even if it's Salesforce, right? And you've got both
They probably won't be
organizations.
the same though.
They probably won't be, right? One's got HubSpot, one's got salespeople, or what is Salesforce or whatever. But even if they are the same, once you dig beneath that, the way that those CRMs are set up, the way that their pipelines are set up, the rules around how you enter information and what you're supposed to do, everything about a CRM system is kind of unique to the organization that's using it, right?
Yeah.
And so you now think, okay, the logical thing you have to do is bring those two together so you have one book of record in the CRM. And
Yeah.
that is not a simple process, right? You think
No.
about it, you've got the way that they structure. So you take, I don't know, take Morgan Stanley, right? So you've got all of the different either territories or businesses within Morgan Stanley all sit underneath the parent, Morgan Stanley. That may be how one organization runs it. Another organization runs it completely differently, right? They don't have a parent organization and children and siblings. They just have different units. I know of an organization that shall remain nameless where there are six versions of Salesforce. So you're now an account rep who has the responsibility for looking after major accounts at this organization that cover six different versions of Salesforce, all of which are slightly different, right? The way they're
Yeah.
structured.
You've got to log in 6 times.
Six times. And it's all slightly different. You can imagine it's a total nightmare. And that's before you get to other tools, right? For me, the big one is always the CRM system. And honestly, we've all been through CRM, or most people who have been through a CRM migration. It's a nightmare. And so we should actually have a conversation on this podcast actually in the future with a RevOps guy, because it's one that needs to be
Yeah.
done. And if you do it right, and it's not just there, right? So if you think about all the other different tech tools that get used, even in an organization before you make an acquisition, often they're siloed and they don't all communicate and talk to each other, right? Which they should do. So RevOps people make that happen so that actually you have an integrated set of tools that work logically. But then you try and put two organizations together that have got those, and if they're not quite talking, it becomes very complicated.
And also, it's a bit of a poison chalice. No manager really wants to take it on because they think, if I succeed at this, I'll just get a slight pat on the back, and if I fail, I'll be fired. So
That's exactly
it's a
right.
scary task to take that on.
And when you're trying to do it, the disruption it causes, everyone's got an opinion, everyone wants it run a certain way, everyone wants it. I mean, it's a real nightmare. It's a real nightmare, which is probably why it's best to hire an outside consultant, because
Yeah,
you
we
can
should
blame
definitely
them.
cover that in a future podcast. Definitely, it'd be a very
Yeah, we
interesting.
will. I think
Get
it's
a
a really
guest on
big
and talk
subject.
about that.
Yeah. So, but even if you've got them aligned, right now you've got differences in terms of data hygiene, the way you structure the CRM system and so on, different rules and reports and all that kind of stuff, right? You've got to sort all that stuff out too. And I want to just go back to culture a little bit, because one thing we didn't really talk about was your leadership style, because this also ties slightly into the tech stack. So
Yeah,
who is going to now run that sales organization? Because they will have a slightly different view, absolutely guaranteed, from their counterpart at the other organization. So whoever's going to lead it, one half of the sales organization are going to have to make significant changes to a lot of what they do, including the way that they're managed, which again presents risks around, people leaving and so on. How are they going to set up their compensation schemes to transition across and to make sure that everybody has a fair crack at the whip. Otherwise, you end up with teams that have far richer compensation plans or far better territories or product sets to sell. All of these things can create the environment in which people decide they're going to leave. And this business of, tech stack can be a significant part of that problem. If people just find that they're spending all their time on admin just trying to figure out what on earth is going on with a particular prospect or client, they get fed up with it and they want to move on, but they don't have to do it.
Right.
So it's a real problem.
Fantastic. We will definitely getting into the weeds on this, because I think there's a lot of value in doing that and getting some people who've been in the weeds and had to sort these things out, and who can explain how much pain there was and what the upside was as they came through the tunnel. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a lovely weekend.
Hi, this is Greg Grimer after the show. Anyone of our listeners who knows of a CRM integration after an acquisition that's gone well or badly, and feels they can talk to that point, and is allowed to talk, obviously, we'd welcome having you as a guest on the show to do that. So if you know of anyone who can make recommendations, or you want to recommend yourself, please get in touch with me via the email address in the show notes. Thank you.